Lessons from the Legends, the National Parks, America's Best Idea? In this presentation, we will trace the history of the national parks from their sketchy origins in the 1800s to the establishment of the National Park Service in 1916, to the development of a widely admired and emulated national park system that recently celebrated its 100th anniversary. Along the way, we will discuss contested claims for the national parks, including the campfire creation story and Wallace Stegner's proclamation that the national parks are America's best idea. We will also characterize the national parks as unfinished business and recount the history of the National Park Service through the eyes of 7 of its former directors who have been designated legends by the American Academy for Park and Recreation Administration. Finally, we will discuss the prospects for the national parks in an increasingly urban and ethnically, culturally, and racially diverse society. In an often-cited 1983 commentary, Wallace Stegner, Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist and environmentalist, proclaimed that the national parks are the best idea we ever had. Absolutely American, absolutely democratic, they reflect us at our best rather than our worst. The purpose of our presentation is to examine Stegner's proclamation in the light of history and to discuss the significance of the national parks to our American way of life. To achieve our purpose, we will not only draw on multiple sources, we will feature the words and deeds of 7 former directors of the NPS who have been designated legends by the American Academy for Park and Recreation Administration as part of its Legends in Parks and Recreation series. Horace Albright, the 2nd director, Newton Drury, the 4th director, Conrad Worth, the 6th director, Russell Dickinson, the 11th director, William Penmont Jr., the 12th director, Robert Stanton, the 15th director, and Fran Manila, the 16th director. We begin by taking you back to the evening of September 19, 1870, and a campfire conversation attributed to members of the Washburn-Langford-Doane expedition, a group of Montanans who had traveled south from Helena to the region we know today as Yellowstone National Park, to witness for themselves what John Coulter and other early explorers had described as a wondrous collection of thermal peculiarities bubbling up through the Earth's crust. As Horace Albright, the 2nd director of the NPS, tells the story, at this last evening's encampment near the confluence of the Gibbon and Firehole rivers, or what we know today as Madison Junction, the conversation turned to how the area might be divided among the expedition's profit-minded entrepreneurs. But one member of the party, a lawyer named Cornelius Hedges, suggested a higher purpose for Yellowstone's thermal wonders. They should be protected, he said, in the form of a national park for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. And soon thereafter, with support from a 2nd expedition the following year, including artists and photographers who captured the essence of Yellowstone's extraordinary scenic splendors, their efforts resulted in President Ulysses S. Grant's signature affixed to the act creating Yellowstone National Park, our first national park, on March 1st, 1872.
He belonged to what is known as the Washburn-Langford-Doane Party, which covered the park, an exploratory trip, and this was their last night in the park, and they were on the campfire. They were talking about what we're going to do with this area, what could be done with this area that they had learned so much about, and they were very suggestions given to us to how it might be acquired, how it might be cut up, how people might get private participation in the ownership of the land. And then Judge Hedges spoke up and said that the area was too fine and should be reserved for the public as a national park. And they were big enough and generous and sensible enough to accept that idea. There was no more talk about acquiring any part of it in private ownership. However, there's been a party there before in 1869 known as the Folsom Peterson party that did a partial survey of the area, and they had mentioned the advisability of preserving it. And they were probably, to a great extent, inspired the 1870 trip. And to that extent, there was a thought given out before. Whether Judge Hedges knew that or not, we don't know. We don't know what extent that little reference of the Cook-Folsom party influenced Hedges. My own feeling is that it was spontaneous on Hedges' part, and there's also been a thought that Yosemite, which was Yosemite Valley, and the big Mariposa big trees were given to the state of California in 1864, that might have influenced it, but there's no evidence that they knew about the Yosemite.
However inspiring the campfire creation story emanating from the Washburn-Langford Doane expedition of 1870, and however inspiring Stegner's characterization of the national parks as America's best idea, recent historical research has cast considerable doubt on the authenticity of both stories. In the first instance, Yellowstone historian Aubrey Haynes and others have demonstrated that the origins of the national park idea are much more nuanced and complex than the campfire creation story would have us believe. Indeed, there is evidence of at least 3 other occasions dating back to the 1830s when the idea of a public park in the West had been suggested. And there is also evidence that the motives for establishing the national parks were not as altruistic as the campfire story indicates. In the second instance, Stegner himself identified another individual, James Bryce, the British ambassador to the United States in the early part of the 20th century, as the likely originator of the best idea observation. And in William Everhart's National Park Service, conservationist Marty Murray is credited with having been the original source. As Stegner concluded in deference to Bryce, the tracing of ideas is a guessing game. We can't tell who first had an idea, we can only tell who had it influentially. Nevertheless, sifting through the ashes of both stories, we are left to ponder what else we might have been taught about the national parks that we will have to unlearn in the increasing light of history. In retrospect, the first half of the 20th century was devoted largely to the expansion and development of the national park system. NPS Legends, Albright, Drury, and Worth, in particular, presided over an increasingly diverse array of scenic and historic parks. Early on, the NPS director's challenge was to secure public support for the newly formed national park system by encouraging access, building facilities, and making the parks inviting and comfortable tourist destinations. Railroads brought visitors to the parks, and large hotels like Old Faithful Lodge in Yellowstone, the Ahwahnee in Yosemite, and El Tovar on the south rim of the Grand Canyon ensured that a visit to the national parks could be both enjoyable and restful. As Albright recounts it, the Depression years had little effect on the national parks because the parks had been poorly funded to begin with.
When Congress authorized Yellowstone National Park in 1872, they made no appropriations for it. First superintendent was Mr. Langford of the Washburn-Langford Party of 1870. He was appointed the first superintendent. He served for 5 years without any pay and paid his own expenses, but they gave him no money to do anything about the area. And then they appointed another man, Colonel Norris, who served 5 years, and they did pay him something and gave him a little money, and he started the roads. But there was no money to keep out poachers, and people that broke up the delicate geyser formations and so forth. The only thing they could do was, they caught him, was to physically throw him out of the area, because Yellowstone is a 100% federal area, the same as District of Columbia. It doesn't belong to any state and doesn't belong to any county or any city or anything, you see. So then they had 3 more superintendents, all of whom tried to do something, but couldn't do it without any money. They just couldn't protect the area and going from bad to worse. And then Congress passed an act authorizing the Secretary to call on the military for troops. And in August 1986, Secretary of the Interior called on the War Department to send troops to the park. And they were there protecting the park until 1918. cavalry. That was their main job, was to protect the park. As other parks were created, Yosemite came along next, and Sequoia. As I say, Mackinac didn't really figure as a national park. As the others came along, they called on the military to patrol them. But in the case of Yosemite and Sequoia and General Grant parks, those three parks here in California, they only had them up in the summertime. They'd come up from Monterey or from San Francisco in the summertime and patrol the parks and try to keep the sheep out. And they were being overrun by sheep. And as the other parks were created, they were some local fellow was put in charge, and sometimes the Forest Service, nearby Forest Service officers looked after the area. And if some roads were being built, as they were in Mount Rainier and Crater Lake, an Army engineer or his assistant helped out in administering the areas. So it was a pretty loose organization all around. They were very lucky that nothing serious happened.
Concern over visitor impacts from mounting use was not yet an issue because the American public was largely immobile until after the Second World War. Then, equipped with more discretionary income, more discretionary time, and more knowledge about available opportunities, an increasingly mobile citizenry began to grow into what historian Foster Ray Dulles called its recreational heritage. An explosion of newfound interest in the national parks led Director Worth to launch Mission 66 in 1956, a 10-year program of expansion of the national parks infrastructure to accommodate burgeoning demand, the conclusion of which was to coincide in 1966 with the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the NPS. In the second half of the 20th century, national park visitation accelerated with corresponding impacts on environmental quality and the quality of visitor experiences. Managerial terms like recreational conflict and recreational carrying capacity made their way into the nomenclature, and recreation's problematic side revealed itself. Costs as well as benefits flowing from the public's enjoyment of their national parks became increasingly evident, and management issues across the system manifested themselves in a variety of forms, including automobile congestion and concomitant air pollution, snowmobiles and associated air and noise pollution, unsightly and noisy overflights in the Grand Canyon, and various avant-garde uses of the national parks, such as mountain climbing, hang gliding, base jumping, wingsuit flying, and other manifestations of the right of the citizenry to enjoy their national parks in whatever manner they pleased. Underpinning the tensions associated with the preservation versus use issue was a dualistic view of national park management that had existed since the NPS's establishment in 1916. The Organic Act's language separated people from nature in theory and practice. The Act conveyed a sense that people were visitors to the national parks, and that the national parks in their pristine condition should be largely devoid of human influence. This view ignored a long human history in places now designated as national parks, places like Yellowstone, Yosemite, the Grand Canyon, and the Everglades. The Organic Act wrote indigenous peoples out of the parks, figuratively and literally. In Florida, for example, the Miccosukee were removed from Everglades National Park to a reservation at its northern boundary. In the light of history, dispossessing native peoples from their homeland to create a national park hardly seems like a noble undertaking. Indeed, many critics of the national parks view their creation as a social construction of a dominant Western European culture, more so than a laudable expression of a universal ideal. Alan Spears, Cultural Resource Director of the National Parks and Conservation Association, put it bluntly. Parks are not America's best idea, and describing them as such may be preventing us from creating and sustaining the diverse constituency our national parks need to survive and thrive in their second century. Any African American worth his or her salt will tell you that national parks don't crack the top 10 list of best ideas. The Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1965 respectively, all occupy a higher place in the order of best ideas than our national parks. The best idea language has the potential to alienate more people than it attracts, because it assumes we all regard national parks with the same unfettered and unequal devotion. This is simply not the case. Spears' criticism reminds us that the history of the national parks is more marbled than we typically care to admit, and that architects of the national park system did some damage as well as good along the way. His criticism also speaks to the challenge of sustaining support for the national parks from a highly urbanized and increasingly diverse citizenry that has become more and more detached from the natural world. If, as Chawla contends, children who grow up apart from nature become adults who are indifferent towards nature, one has to wonder where support for the national parks will come from in the future. As we begin the 21st century, the significance of the national park system to our way of life is an important question to ponder. Parks are islands of hope, William Brown once proclaimed, but his pronouncement no longer resonates like it once did. First and foremost, ecology teaches us that we cannot simply draw political boundaries around places and look after them as if they were separate from everything else. Parks are intimately connected to places and people beyond their borders, and park managers must understand that they have to partner with places and people beyond park borders if they are to be successful park stewards. NPS legends Russell Dickinson, William Penn Mott Jr., and Fran Manila epitomized this orientation to service in their role as Park Service directors. They understood that the citizenry at large must take ownership of the national parks if the parks are to endure. Citizens must come to see themselves as the primary stakeholders, custodians of their natural and cultural heritage. Given the increasingly diverse ethnic, cultural, and racial makeup of the American people, the magnitude of this challenge is daunting. AAPRA legend Chris Jarvie and former Associate Director of Partnerships and Visitor Experience for the NPS under Fran Manila reported that when asked on a survey why they hadn't visited their national parks, an all too frequent response was, "Because I don't see anybody that looks like me."
Employees. If you look at the population of the Park Service, the majority of them were term employees at one time. If you look at this population of 3,000, I will tell you that the future of the Park Service will be in that 3,000 employees at some time. 20 years from now, they'll be sitting around the NLC table and deciding where we go and what we do. We have a tremendous opportunity to diversify that group and do exactly what we want to do, like at no other time in history. And we're talking about that at the National Leadership Council. And the objective is to go out and try to get, for example, school teachers in inner cities that already deal with inner city kids, so we can meet their needs and get them in that, not only in the classroom, but get them out in these term positions. The other thing we're doing is we're trying to reach out with technology. If you can't get the kids to the parks, get the parks to the kids. And so we have a wonderful Web Ranger program right now that is getting a great reception by the kids, because we develop it with the kids involved. Again, marketing. We don't call it that because it's bad work, but the theory here is to get them exposed, even if it's only in a virtual way, so that at some point they'll have that curiosity. They'll know that those parks are there, and they'll reach out and go use them. So I have a lot of faith that what we're doing is on the right track, and we can do something with this that is very, very meaningful in the near future.
Curious when the folks who review this tape in 25 years' time look at it, and we'll find out.
Citizens must come to see themselves as the primary stakeholders, custodians of their natural and cultural heritage. How, then, can we make the national parks more relevant to an increasingly multicultural citizenry's lived experience? Part of an answer rests in expanding the NPS's presence in urban areas where 80% of Americans live. Robert Stanton, the 15th director of the NPS, epitomizes the possibility for making the national parks more relevant to contemporary life. Stanton attended a historically black college in Houston where he was given the opportunity to work in Grand Teton National Park under a minority recruitment program initiated by then Secretary of the Interior Stuart Udall under President John F. Kennedy's direction. While at Grand Teton, Russell Dickinson, chief ranger at the park, mentored Stanton. In the ensuing years, young Stanton made the most of his opportunity, and he rose through the ranks to eventually become the director of the NPS, the first ever director who had to be confirmed by the United States Senate. Reflecting on his earlier tenure as deputy director of the National Capital Parks region in Washington, D.C., Stanton remarked that
one activity that's really sets, I think, National Capital Region apart from the other region is the special events, and particularly citizens from all walks of life in all parts of the country exercising their constitutional rights of freedom of speech. And so therefore there's all kinds of demonstrations, protests, that really is sort of a democratic process in motion. And I just enjoyed working with groups of 20 to groups of 500,000. Yeah.
Stanton's life has been a synecdoche, an individual expression of the larger society's moral growth and development. Just as the nation moved from segregation to integration, from civil unrest to civil rights, so too has Robert Stanton personified the expansion of our liberal democratic tradition. His life, like the NPS's life, like our nation's life, is testimony to the possibility that imperfect people can aspire to a more perfect union. The NPS, among its many duties and responsibilities, is obliged to help us get our nation's story straight. This requires owning up to its failings as well as the failings of others. The NPS appears willing to do this, as can be seen in renaming the Custer Battlefield National Monument in Montana the Little Bighorn Battlefield, and in telling the American Indians side of the story as well as Custer's. It can also be seen in California's Manzanar National Historic Site, a World War II Japanese-American prison camp where American citizens were denied their civil rights from 1942 to 1945. Paraphrasing Elliot West, the NPS is in the revisionist business after all, treating history respectfully as its obligation, and revising and building on what that history has taught us is its job. To the extent the NPS carries out this responsibility conscientiously, the light of history may yet someday credit the agency with overseeing what has truly become one of America's most enduring and best ideas.
Well, the first thing I think I might just give a little description of Mather. He stood about 6'1", maybe a little more than that. He was a very fine-looking fellow. He had a very heavy head of hair, prematurely gray, in fact, almost white. He was 47 years old when he came down and promised to take this position. He was an extrovert and full of ideas, and loved the social life. Could start a party on any pretext. He was not a drinker, though. He would take a drink, but he wouldn't. I didn't enter into his life to an extent. He didn't smoke very often. He wouldn't smoke a cigarette if necessary to do it. He thought so. He smoked a cigar once in a while. But he was just a fine fellow, well met, you know. And the people instinctively liked him. You know, you wouldn't be with him 5 minutes and you say, well, this is a guy I want to be around with. I like him. I think he's great. And so he'd meet people, particularly up around Congress. They like him, and he gave parties and luncheons, and of course he'd go out with them. His idea was to get them out in the parks. He worked at that right away, and he'd join them in the field, and that would give him a chance to do things for him. He was always seeing to it that they got a little fishing trip in, a little something extra that wasn't on the schedule. And he took particular pains to do that. One year he particularly wanted the group to end their, I think it was the Appropriation Committee, he wanted them to end their tour at Yellowstone. Well, they didn't have Yellowstone on their program that year. They'd been there a year before. They felt they didn't need to go, and he couldn't get them to do it. They just didn't have time, they said, and they couldn't fit it in. They didn't see any particular need to do it. So he invited their wives to go to Yellowstone as his guests, pay their fare and their expenses.
That got him there, didn't it?
That got them. They
Well,
changed their plans so they could meet their wives. So they didn't dare do anything else.
I remember so many meetings with him. Every time he came to San Francisco, I think I saw him, as I always saw Horace. I remember once on Market Street, I met him, and he was coming out of the Sheldon building with Dan Hull, remember, the landscape architect. And he said, wait a minute, I want to show you something. So he hauled out a set of beautifully illuminated plans, and I said, what is this, Grand Central Station? He said, no, this is the new hotel, the Ahwahnee, that they're going to build at Yosemite.
Yeah.
And another time, I remember when they dedicated the, I guess you weren't there, and they dedicated the museum at Yosemite in the headquarters building.
No, I wasn't there. I was there when they laid it out, but I wasn't there for the
days when
dedication.
they used to have a corps of rangers on horseback and had quite a ceremony. But I remember he was meeting me on the street and saying, why don't you come up to Yosemite? Well, I said, I haven't been invited. Well, he said, I'll invite you. And he said, I've rented a special car which is going to be attached to the Southern Pacific. We're going up by way of Stockton. He picked up Elmer Reynolds there. And he said, as an inducement, well, I'll let you and Mrs. Drury have the drawing room at the end of the car, which he did.
That's typical of them.
Yeah.